Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show, the pre-Thanksgiving edition. Chad will be back on Monday. On the phone with us is Marc Morano, and Marc, a longtime friend of mine and a guy who I worked with on Capitol Hill for many years. And Marc is one of the chief climate change debunkers in the United States. He has a website called Climate Depot. Has produced videos, television shows, been interviewed on Fox several times, on national television networks about climate change and what the whys and wherefores and what the real hidden agendas are behind the people pushing climate change. And Marc, I want to kind of separate this into two parts. I want to talk about how you think we got to the point we're at right now with the COVID-19, because it ties in very closely, or I think it's going to tie in very closely with climate change. And then let's get to Senator Kerry, who Joe Biden has named as his climate czar for whatever reason or another, that he's just as crazy as Biden is with this. So, Marc, welcome to the show. How did we get on this COVID-19 stuff? How did we let a bunch of guys in lab coats push us around?
Well, it's a very good question, man. It's not a quick, easy answer, but the simplest answer I can come up with is the public health bureaucracy is literally a arm of the progressive left in many aspects. In other words, they see the world as they see a free people out there as a messy omelet that they need to get control of for virus purposes, for public health purposes. They've waged war on American freedom for decades in terms of specific industries. Most recently they tried to destroy and they actually did destroy the American vaping industry, which was the fastest growing small business in America. The CDC led the charge because some teenagers went out and bought some illegal black market marijuana vapes, got sick. Some of them died. So the CDC, knowing it was not actually regular vaping causing this, and vaping is much a safer alternative to smoking because there's no combustion, they went out and they literally told people not to vape. Now, fast forward, cigarette use is now back to, went up record amounts since the CDC did that. Meanwhile, the FDA says, anyway, so they have an agenda. They've destroyed the American vaping industry, one of the fastest growing small businesses, because it's a nanny state in essence, and it's actually anti-public health in that regard. So what happened was when COVID came along, they were waiting the way gun control advocates wait for a school shooting or a mall shooting. They pounce with their ready, set solution to everything. Once we had, and regardless of what you think of gun control, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When the gun control people come out, this is why we need X, Y, Z. We need to ban weapons. We need handgun control. Same thing happened with this virus. They said, this is what we've always predicted. We need massive controls. We need to declare a public health emergency. They declare a public health emergency, and literally overnight suspended civil liberties that we fought world wars over, that we fought for our independence over, and in ways that in terms of the general population, now you can argue Japanese internment, you can argue segregation, slavery, but in terms of a general wide population, we have never in our history of our country experienced this kind of taking away of our rights as a general population issue, where you can't go to church, you can't even have certain people over to your house. It's the Sovietization of America all overnight. Another way of putting it is the Green New Deal was implemented almost overnight. Guaranteed income, federal taxes, ban on airline travel, restaurants closing, transportation being heavily regulated, every aspect of your life. This was their dream, and the COVID solutions are what climate activists have now embraced, and the fact they're using COVID for more climate action. John Kerry himself has said it will lead to more zoological diseases, zoonogical, meaning diseases from animals. So they're jumping on this, and I'll leave you with this. Jane Fonda, the actress, actually said, COVID is God's gift to the left, exact quote. And what she means by that is, if you are the regulatory state, you want a public health emergency because then you can control every aspect of people's life. It's part of your ideology. Free people are messy and should be stopped. And this is what we're facing. So that's my senatorial filibuster.
Yeah, well, that's all right, Marc. We're talking to Marc Morano at Climate Depot, climatedepot.com, if you want a breath of fresh air for what the real story is behind clowns like John Kerry and Al Gore, and particularly, for us in Texas, being an oil and gas state, it's a particularly sensitive issue because if they had their way, they'd end a lot of the drilling and of course, fracking. Biden said it; he backed off it, but he said it nevertheless. I can't imagine John Kerry is an oil and gas fan, but we'll get to Stoneface in a minute. So your theory then, Mark, is that the public health guys are all a bunch of wacky progressives, leftist control freaks, and they're using COVID to gain the power that they've sought for decades. Here, and I think you're right, but here's my question.
It's ideology, yeah.
Well,
it's driven by ideology, but there's also a lot of money. I mean, especially when you're talking, one of the reasons they downplayed hydrochloroquine, if I'm saying that correctly, is because if that was an effective cure, then the vaccine, which people can make trillions off of, was never going to be necessary. And that's what they're freaking out about when it comes to. That's why any remedy that comes up, they're always all poo-pooing it. No, that's no good. Oh, we can't recommend that.
Why did the GOP roll over? I mean, you had Pence, you had Trump, you had Cruz, Rand Paul. They all jumped on the vaccine bandwagon. I mean, what do you account that to?
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, I've never been. I mean, my favorite is Alex Behrens, who's a former New York Times reporter. I've never been an anti-vaxxer. My kids are vaccinated, Matt. Never even really gave it too much thought. But when I saw the way they were doing this whole COVID presentation in terms of the hype and the public health crisis and the lockdowns and the mandates, and they wouldn't allow any of the treatments to even be experimented on. And they were pulling doctors off and censoring them on YouTube and not inviting. We have Nobel Prize-winning chemists not invited to scientific conferences because they don't support lockdowns, which lockdowns were never even on the menu for the World Health Organization or CDC ever. They were never proposed. It's just they thought they could get away with it because China was sending us scary videos. So to answer that question is Republicans are afraid. Donald Trump disappointed me on this. Early on, people like Michael Fomento, who had followed the CDC for decades, wrote the book about the myth of heterosexual AIDS. Remember, the CDC was claiming that AIDS didn't discriminate and that AIDS was going to be spreading like wildfire and millions of people. And he wrote the book. This was a researcher, Michael Fomento, and he went right after Fauci and the CDC back at the time, said the whole thing was absolute hysteria, was not based in science. It was a blood-borne disease that was not going to spread to the general public. And he turned out to be absolutely right. And he then, in January of this year, wrote New York Post articles warning about the hype and hysteria about COVID. So I was well aware in January, February of this, when Donald Trump signed the executive order allowing the governors to lock down, I was screaming everywhere I could. I did a video back in March, or maybe it was April 1st that it came out, but I taped it in March, totally opposed to these lockdowns. Donald Trump allowed this. It was probably the greatest blunder of a U.S. president in 40 years to allow this, because now they have the template. And so Republicans are afraid. They don't want to be blamed for deaths. So they are either, you mentioned Rand Paul, Ted Cruz. They are gently pushing back, but they generally don't attack the entire narrative. There's a few congressmen, Andy Biggs, I believe, is one, a couple others that have been really strong. And, of course, my favorite governor is Kristi Noem of South Dakota. She has given speeches against lockdowns. And her famous line was, as a governor, I looked at the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution and state Constitution, and I looked for what authority I had. And she found that she didn't have the authority to prevent people from congregating in a restaurant, from doing protests, from going to church, from having backyard barbecues. And so she didn't exercise her authority.
Yeah, she's my hero. She's my hero. And when we come back, we're going to talk about my the alternate to being a hero, to being a villain, and that's John Kerry. He's got too much Botox or whatever he's shot into his face. We're listening and talking to Marc Morano, climatedepot.com, a reasoned and cogent voice out there amongst the crazy scientists trying to sell us down the road. Mark, stay on. We're going to come back to you. You're listening to the Chad Hasty Show on KFYO. Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show. I'm Matt Crow filling in for Chad Hasty. We'll be back on Monday morning. On the phone, I've got Marc Morano, who runs the Climate Depot, climatedepot.com, if you'd like to read more about how the crazies and the leftists are trying to steer us into the disaster. Hey, Mark, I was thinking about this coming into work this morning. I read your article about how the lab coats tried to say that the cranberries are going the way of the dinosaur because of climate change and being Thanksgiving. Are we even allowed to have Thanksgiving? Does that contribute to climate change?
I mean, traditionally, yeah, they want you to have a tow turkey, not a real turkey, and that's one of the tenets of the Green New Deal is a war on meat eating, to the point where we've had UN climate chiefs say restaurants should have separate sections for a small section for the remaining meat eaters, treat them like we used to treat smoking sections, put them in the back by the restroom or put them in the back by the kitchen. So, no, they do not want you eating meat. They do not want modern agriculture. They want us to live like a small agrarian societies cut off, as the World Economic Forum out of Davos has said, their vision of the future is we envision a world which you'll own nothing, but you'll be happy.
So we've got old Stoneface now, who's going to be the special presidential envoy for climate. And Jim Acosta tweeted, I'm reading from your site, former Secretary of State John Kerry will fight climate change full-time as special presidential envoy for climate and will sit on the National Security Council. This marks the first time that the National Security Council will include an official dedicated to climate change. What do you make of that?
I mean, a couple of things. Okay, there's going to be three fronts here, actually. There's going to be an international diplomacy, and Kerry will be involved in that as Biden's climate envoy. He'll be dealing with the United Nations. My favorite quote was Senator Tom Cotton, who said, "This is John Kerry's ideal job. He gets to stay in luxurious hotels in Central Europe and negotiate deals that are bad for America." That pretty much sums up John Kerry's entire career going back to post-Vietnam.
I mean, 5-star hotels. He wakes up around 11 o'clock in the morning after doing God knows what the night before, and has a sumptuous lunch with white Riesling, with Riesling wines, and then puts on a $5,000 Briona suit and goes to a meeting which lasts an hour at WHO or something, right? Then, goes off and water skis or mountain climbs or goes boating with his friends, and then comes back for a 6-course dinner at another hotel, and then winds it all up about midnight and slips back into his, silk pajamas, and he'll do this for the entire Biden administration. I mean, the guy's, you got to hand it to him, Mark. The guy's got a racket, and he's running it pretty well. But honestly, though, I mean, Kerry, talk about the height of hypocrisy. I mean, the guy's got a private jet, 2 yachts, 16 homes. I mean, his lifestyle nowhere near comes through to being green or anything else. I mean, green for money. It's green for the money that he's got from his wife's fortune. But what kind of...
He didn't even inherit his wealth. I mean, what kind of aristocrat does that? He married it. So he's not even... polite society, even the impolite don't welcome him for that reason.
But he'll remind you that he went sailing with President Kennedy when he was a young man. But what kind of...
Did you mention it? He has a house in Martha's Vineyard. Now, he called climate deniers. He said they were members of the Flat Earth Society who believe that sea level rise will spill over the edge of the flat Earth. Well, what does that make John Kerry, who has a house at Martha's Vineyard, right on the water? So near President Obama's, by the way, to another climate activist. That tells you a lot right there about how serious they take this issue.
So what about this? Go ahead. I was going to say, what about this Paris Accord now? I mean, and Biden's openly talked about getting the United States back into it. What are we facing with that?
Well, the interesting thing there is the Paris Accord was negotiated in 2015. I was actually at the UN summit in 2015. We had the premiere of our first film, Climate Hustle. We had police had to shut down our premiere while they cleared out all the protesters, the climate activists. The New York Times printed it that we were having our premiere. I had wanted posters all over the city. So that gives you an idea of how the UN Paris Agreement doesn't like any dissent. That was point one. Point two is that they declared after they signed this that, in fact, John Kerry said, we have saved the earth for future generations. This is the proudest moment of my career. He signed it as a part of the U.S. delegation with his granddaughter on his lap. I think she was about 7 or 8 years old, showing that this was for future generations. He was doing it. But here's the thing, Matt. Just like we had 2 weeks to flatten the curve back in March and life would be normal, everyone from Al Gore to the United Nations, the U.S. senators, to Obama himself, all said this is the greatest accomplishment. We solved global warming. And now Kerry says yesterday it wasn't enough. All the UN officials talk about the UN Paris Agreement was woefully inadequate. It's not going to work. And guess what? They want 10, 20, 30 times the strength of the original Paris Agreement in order to save the planet. So just like there's no way to ever flatten the curve with lockdowns, there's no way to ever save the planet with UN treaties. They just keep coming and getting more stringent and stringent. And Kerry's number one goal is going to be to reinstate the U.S. in that and crank up our commitments, which means pain and punishment for more pain and punishment for the American economy and the people.
You know, at climatedepot.com, you've got some great quotes. One of my favorites, former President Dwight Eisenhower in 1961 said, quote, "We must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. A government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity, and the prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded." And I think that fits Fauci to a T.
It does. He actually says a substitute for intellectual curiosity is a government grant. That's what we've seen in the climate debate, and that's what you can see now. There are so many parallels. And Terry's right. There are parallels between COVID and climate, but it's not the kind of parallels you want to see. The idea is the government funds a certain mindset, and they eliminate any dissent.
Yeah, exactly. We've been listening to Marc Morano. Mark, thanks again. ClimateDepot.com. That's ClimateDepot.com for the straight scoop on what the climate change lunatics are pushing